Greetings and welcome to the Upper Pen Podcast. My name is Dakota Van Linden, and today I'm talking with Nick Podehl. You'll recognize his voice from audiobooks such as The King Killer Chronicles by Patrick Rothfus, the Land series by Aleron King, Bibliomancer by James Hunter, and books by Nora Roberts, Mercedes Lackey, and Philip K. Dick. His cast of character adds richness and weight to any story, and I, for one, will listen to just about anything he narrates. Thank you, Nick, for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Dakota.
So tell me how you got started as a narrator.
Honestly, because I listened to my mother. My mom and grandparents, who I was really close with growing up, they've always been avid audiobook fans since it was on tape, way back in the day. And I remember listening to Jurassic Park, I think, with my mom on a road trip to Florida. Where my brother was asleep and mom and I were in the front seats and listening to Jurassic Park on the way there. And I mean, that was my first exposure to it. But after that, as I got older, never really thought anything of it. It wasn't something that I continued being into. But in college, I was getting ready to graduate and working as a bartender and hated it. I was a theater major, but changed it because I thought, well, I'm never going to be able to make a living doing this, so I'm going to just be a communications major instead. But just really wasn't liking where things were going. But my mom had said, hey, remember those audiobooks we used to listen to when you were younger? There is a company that is in the next town over from where we live that makes audiobooks, and you could do that. And I was like, okay, Mom, sure. You're my biggest fan. Like, you got to say these things. But I was like, you know what? I got nothing to lose. So I was like, okay, Mom, let's put together a demo. Find some of your like talking cat mystery books and that have great, good characters, and we'll put together a demo together on your laptop, and it'll be fun. That's what we did. And it was fun because, my mom is my biggest fan. So we had fun with it and sent it in, and I didn't really think anything of it. A few weeks later, I actually got a call from one of the casting directors there. And she had said, hey, we got your demo. Noticed you're from the next town over here. And that's actually where I'm from. And you and my son did high school theater together. So do you still act? And I was like, yeah, sure. And so I went in and auditioned for a book, and they said, great, you're probably not going to get it, but, that's okay. There's a lot more denials in this industry than there are castings. You got to have thick skin. And I was like, okay, sure. It was fun. Thanks for letting me do it. I'm going to go be a bartender again. But they actually cast me for my first book. And that was way back in 2008. It was Mercedes Lackey was the first book that I ever did. Foundation, the Collegium Chronicles, with Mags as the main character. And if your listeners have never actually looked at the print of that book, that was a doozy of a first book to be in, because Mercedes Lackey wrote Mags, the main character, as this I likened it to kind of the way Hagrid talks, where he's you sort of, kind of everything's apostrophes and you can't and you don't know, you can't go there. And that's how she wrote it. I mean, that's how it appears in the script. And so that was my first exposure to narrating audiobooks. And it was so much fun. And just been steadily going ever since, just picking up more and more. And now I do this full time. 12 years later, I'm booked pretty far out and just cranking out books as fast as I can.
What do you think the difference is between narrating audiobooks and voice acting, or is there a difference?
I think there is. I mean, it depends on the medium. I will be completely transparent and say I don't have a lot of experience with other mediums. I've done some commercial voice work. I've done very limited animation voiceover, but I think that it just depends on what medium you're in. With audiobooks, largely, unless you're part of a full cast narration where there are multiple people doing different parts, I'm a one-man show, so all of the characters in the book, if you look at the Rothfus books or Pattern of Shadow and Light by Melissa McPhail, like hundreds of characters in one book. And so I got to do all those. And so it's a little bit different than if I was like cast as the voice of one character in an animation or a video game or something like that. And so they all have their different different positives and negatives, strengths and weaknesses. And I am so thankful for what I get to do, because it's just so much fun trying to come up with different voices for all of these characters.
So that brings me up to another point. How do you keep track of whose voice sounds like what in a book? Do you write yourself like a script, or how does this work?
So I think everybody has a different process. Mine is that when I get cast for a book, I will read through the entire book, word for word, no skimming, because I'm marking it up as I'm going along, much like I would like a stage script, where, instead of just highlighting all of my lines, I sort of make a little color mark next to different characters. So, Steve will be red and Elizabeth will be orange. And so then every time Elizabeth talks, there's a little orange dot. And then I'll know, like, okay, as I'm reading it in the booth, then when I'm recording it, that kind of gives me my cue of who's talking. But then on top of that, I also have a separate document that has like character notes that the author will either provide in the text, where it'll say Steve had said in a deep, gravelly voice, like, so that gives me a pretty good clue. If there are no clues given in the text, it usually comes out with discussions with the author before I start recording. So we'll go through and talk about all the characters that are in the book. And if, the author is a little less involved in the process and says, yep, just do what you're going to do, then I will make those choices, just to say, like, well, how can I differentiate Steve from Alistair, so that as the listener is following along, they don't have to wait for that indicator that, Alistair said. They can tell who's talking just by what voice I use. And some people like that, and some people don't. So it's, different styles for different listeners.
I always really love it. Like, I love that you do so many different characters in your books. It's like listening to a whole cast, and it's so wonderful.
Well, thank you.
So you mentioned that you have contact with the author sometimes, and sometimes they're very disinterested. How long do you usually spend talking to the author or reading the book or doing your prep before you actually get to the booth?
I am a very slow reader. So when I'm prepping a project, it takes me about as long to read through it initially as it does to record it, just because I'm constantly stopping to make notes, look things up, because that's the other thing that I have to do is if I don't know exactly how to pronounce a word, like 100% certain, I got to look it up, because, I'll get called out on that, and I want to get it right. And then there are those instances where, like with a lot of the fantasy books, you've got words that the author makes up. And so as part of my preparation process, I go through and highlight and write down all those words to submit it to the author to say, hey, how do you say this? And sometimes they know and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they say, like, I don't know how you say it. I just know how you write it. It's like, okay, well, let's figure this out then. So all totaled, like, your average sized book is like 9 to 12 hours in length. It's pretty typical. So that will take me about a week to record, and it will also take me about a week to prepare. So, because I do have a family and a life outside of work. So, but I will usually spend an hour or two on the phone with an author if they want to have that correspondence and involvement. Otherwise, sometimes I'll just submit a list to them and they will send it back to me with phonetic pronunciations or like suggestions of like, well, you say it like this person says their name or something like that.
Okay. That seems helpful, but also, like, for the authors who don't know, that seems like it's like a disaster.
Well, it can be, and sometimes it's fun because sometimes we'll joke about, like, well, how do you think it's pronounced? Like, I don't know. Well, what do you think? Like, I can guess and say I like the way this sounds. Oh yeah, I like that too. Let's go with that. Um, you know. But then there are other authors who are like, nope, I know exactly how this is structured in a language format that I've devised, and these are how these vowels interact with consonants, and they need to be said exactly this way. So it's fun. I mean, there's such a wide range of involvements.
Yeah, so I remember reading the first couple of chapters of Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfus, and then I started listening to the audiobook because I was traveling back and forth between Mankato, Minnesota, and Duluth. And after that, I couldn't read the story anymore. And it had to be your voice that was reading it to me. And I was like, what is happening? So I was
Sorry
not
for ruining that for you.
No, it was great. You did it so much better than even my imagination did. And I was like, oh, okay. I guess this is how I'm reading the rest of this series. Well, if the last one ever comes out, but
Well, yeah. Eventually it'll come out.
yeah, I'm sure. um So when you're going through and you're making all those annotations in the book for how a character speaks, do you do like a little test run? Do you like run it by your wife or your fellow audiobook narrators to try and test out the voice, or do you just go with your first instinct?
Generally, the majority of authors want to be involved. And so I have a ready and willing participant and, co-conspirator in the crime of producing this book. And so I have a sounding board to submit these ideas to. When an author says, like, give me a few different takes on this character, I will go through and pick out a block of dialogue from them from the script and record it 4 or 5 different ways with different character voices, and then submit those just little clips to them, and they can say, I liked number 3, I liked the tonal qualities of number 2, but the cadence of number 1, is there any way we can do this again and, kind of merge those? And that's not necessarily the typical format. There are some authors that I work with who, they really want to be a part of the creative process of it. And I think that makes for just a much better final product. But it is more time intensive. But the majority of authors will just say, yep, I like number 1, or, they won't even ask for samples. They'll just say, this is what I think this person sounds like, but if you can't do that or you don't think it sounds good, just go with whatever you think sounds good. So, but I try to stick as close. I do, yeah. I mean, it depends on the project, but largely I'm given a lot of creative license to do what I think sounds good, like how I heard the characters in my head as I was prepping it.
Was that always the case since you first started with that first Mercedes Lackey book, or has that become more the case as you've taken on more jobs and become more recognized?
I think that when I started 12 years ago, the industry was a little different. The whole self-recording and recording at home thing was not really very widespread. We didn't have the same platforms and tools that we do now. The just equipment and machinery was much more expensive, and so there was a pretty prohibitive entry fee, and so it was all largely done through production companies. And back in that time, it was very common to have a narrator who's actually reading, an engineer who is running the equipment, and then a director who is following along and giving creative input and kind of helping to develop some of this stuff. It was kind of their job to find all the pronunciations and get the character list put together. And so then when we got to Alistair, I would say, hey, Joe, what does Alistair sound like? And they would say, well, let's look and see what we got. And, we'd talk about it and hash it out. And, here's the notes that I got from the author. And so it was a little bit of a different beast. And I would say that as the years have gone on, some of that collaborative nature has gone away. I'm going to guess just because of cost, that you can, pay one person to do 3 people's jobs, which is, I get it. I feel like, though, the more creative input you have from different people, the better the all-around project is going to turn out. It's going to take longer. It's going to be more expensive, but I think that it'll be better if there's more creative juices flowing than just, saying, here, Nick, here's a book, make it happen.
So does that mean that you do all of your own editing now too?
No, because
Okay.
I am not a professionally trained audio engineer, and those people go through special training and schooling that that's not my skill set. And I don't really want to take the 4 years of education to learn how to do it. Stick with what you're good at, I guess. So I actually I pay somebody to do my engineering for me, and so what that amounts to is the post-production work. So as I'm recording, I'm the only one here, so I'm the one who's hitting record, stop, but that's about the extent of what I do. I also pay somebody else to proof for me. So once I record an audiobook, I send it off to a proofer so that they are following along, listening, looking at the manuscript to make sure that I'm saying all the right words and catching consistency errors in like characters and stuff like that. So I'm not completely a one-man show. I do rely on the skills of various other professionals.
That's going to make it so much better though, because you seem very much like a creative personality. And if you had to do all the editing, doing the editing, even for these little podcasts that are like 30 minutes, kills me. I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to do this.
I have to imagine that it can be pretty mind numbing. I've proofed a couple of my own projects, and I start to drool after a while and zone off, which is not good because you really need to pay attention. And with the engineering, like I look at the program that I use for recording, and I mean I use Pro Tools, which is kind of the industry standard for recording in all aspects. And I look at it and I'm like, I'm using about 2% of what this program is capable of. I don't even want to open that Pandora's box because I'll get lost.
That seems to be the way of it though. Like it, just send it off. Just send it off.
Punt.
So do you still audition for books, or do you have authors come to you, or more realistically, probably publishing companies come to you, or agents?
The last probably 4 years have been pretty much exclusively just authors coming to me because I do a lot of independent author work. So it's just me and the author, and then we distribute it through the platform of ACX, which is Audiobook Creation Exchange, and they distribute via Audible. And so probably 70%, 80% of what I do is through independent authors. However, I do also still do a lot of work with publishing companies. And I guess because I've been doing this long enough and have enough successful titles under my belt, largely people come to me. The audiobook producing companies will say like, hey, we've got this book that we think your voice would be good for. Either can you send us an audition for it so we can submit it to the author, or just we're going to cast you. When can you do it? Because a lot of times the publishing companies have that freedom to just say like, I mean, that's what casting directors do, is they're given a project and say, find a voice for it. And so they'll, find somebody that they like, or they'll, accept auditions for it. And so starting out, it was definitely like, I'm just auditioning for any title I can and calling up and emailing the production companies and saying like, hey, you got anything for me? I'll do anything. And there's a little bit less of that now. I haven't had to audition for many titles in a couple of years now. So I'm incredibly thankful for that and count myself just so incredibly blessed that that's where I'm at.
All because your mom told you to go to an interview.
All because I listened to my mother. That's right. Mom and grandma and grandpa, they encouraged me to do it, and I said, okay.
You probably know what's right.
You know, you've been around for a while, so you probably know. And look at that, they did. So all you kids out there, listen to your mother.
So you mentioned earlier that you did a lot of auditioning for just about anything. And when you look through your audio page or your I was going to call it your author page, but I don't know if your narrator page.
Catalog of work.
Yes, thank you. Catalog of work. There's a lot of variety of books. Do you have a preference for what kinds of books you take now, or do you still have, like, you'll take Nora Roberts one week and you'll take like Dakota Kraut the next week?
Really, it's not so much that I have a preference of what I want to do or anything like that. I know that lately I've been kind of typecast as the guy for LitRPG, especially, and I think that's awesome. Personally, the kind of stuff that I would tend to read would be fantasy or historical fiction. But before LitRPG became a really big thing, it was pretty much fantasy was kind of the stuff that I was given. And I think because the most comments that I get is for the voices that I do. And that lends itself pretty well to fantasy and sci-fi, where you can really go to some pretty extreme places with voices, whereas historical fiction, like, you're kind of limited to where's the setting, with just regular fiction, a Nora Roberts or something like that. Like, you're pretty well contained within the world that story exists in. And not to say that you can't still have fun and dynamic voices, but you just can't go quite as crazy. So I think that my limitations now are not necessarily of like, I want to do this genre only, or I prefer to do this one. It's more so the ones that I have gotten to the point where I feel like I can pass on, early days, I did some, I'm not going to quite call it erotica, but a little bit more adult material. And I don't feel the need to do that anymore. There have been a few titles that I've done that is like the misogynistic, harem stuff, where I'm just like, no, I don't need to do that anymore. I'm good. You can find somebody else to do that stuff. And so I think some of that comes from, like, I'm busy enough now that I don't feel the need to take those projects. And not that there's anything wrong with those projects. It's just that that's not my cup of tea. I have two little girls. I don't want them to know that daddy's legacy is harem fantasies. So, I'd like to keep a little higher brow than that.
Just for the girls.
Just for the girls.
That works out really well, though, because if you already like fantasy, and then this is the kind of genre that they pulled you into anyway, or that you kind of naturally moved into, that must be like a relief, though, that you can do something that you enjoy.
It is. And I mean, I know that some of the other narrators that I've talked to, like, just like any workplace, you'll exchange, war stories and horror stories of like, oh my gosh, I had to read this book they just yelled through the whole thing. The author had one volume, things like that, where I've largely been very fortunate in the stuff that I have been cast to narrate, and the stuff that I've been asked to do, that it's mostly things that I enjoy, that I would enjoy just picking up and reading. Now, again, full disclosure, like, I read all day, every day, so I don't do a whole lot of pleasure reading anymore. I just don't. But I also feel like I don't really have to, because a lot of the stuff that I have to read for work is stuff that I would read on my own. Um, you know, my my love of reading started actually in college, because in high school it was always, you have to read this. I was like, well, I don't wanna, so it's stupid. Reading's dumb. And it wasn't until college where I was told, you should read this book. What is it? What is it called? Boss of the Lord of the Rings. That's Lord of the Rings. You should try that one. I was like, okay, why not? And I couldn't put it down, which is not good in college because there's a lot of stuff you have to read. But that started it for me, and that really just exploded my love of fantasy, because it was like, these are amazing places with amazing characters. And I would read it and start reading it out loud, because like I'm as the people are talking, because I love doing that stuff. But never thought at that point, like, oh, I could do this for a living someday. So yeah, I'm incredibly glad that I get to read a lot of the stuff that I would normally just pick up.
Do you have a project that you'd really like to do, or is it just work?
Oh man. I would absolutely love to take a crack at some of the historical fiction stuff that, like, so one of the series that I do actually on occasion read just for fun is the Richard Sharp series, which is Napoleonic British 95th Rifles, which, a lot of people are going to say, oh, boring. I love history. And that is one of my favorite time periods, is the Napoleonic Wars, and like the 30 Years War and the 7 Years War. And I love that. And then the Patrick O'Brien Master and Commander series, Captain Jack Aubrey. And I would have so loved to give a crack at those, but I also recognize that those have to be done by a Brit. They really do. And I can do an okay British accent, but I think I would do them a disservice. And I think the same thing about the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is my all-time favorite book ever. And I would love the opportunity to narrate that, but I don't think I would do it justice. I think that has to be done by somebody more epic, a Sir Ian McKellen or something like that. Like it. But yeah, if I could, I would say, you know what, this might not go so well, but I'm gonna give it a shot because I love these books.
I really want to hear you do the Silmarillion. I can't even say the title. See, I would be a terrible narrator. Silmarillion.
There you go.
It's got too many L's.
It does. It does.
Now that you've at the beginning of your career, you started working in studios with directors. How was it transferring to being at home alone? I imagine it was quite distracting at first because you're at home, but also you mentioned you have that less creative input. Mm-hmm. So was it more difficult to be at home?
On all fronts, yes. I mean, there is definitely the benefit of having the flexibility. I can roll into the studio whenever I want, but that also is a challenge because then I have to be disciplined, and I can roll into the studio whenever I want. And so there is that aspect. I do miss the collaborative and creative nature of being in a space with other human beings. I'm also just a very social person. I enjoy human interaction. And so to not have that, I miss it. I really do. There are days where I'm just like, I'm so lonely here. It's just me and the phone. And so, I guess one of the benefits is I talk to myself all day. So, and I'm not crazy, that's kind of expected in my line of work. But I do miss that collaborative nature. And there is the challenge of discipline, of maintaining your deadlines. Like I can say, like, at lunch, well, just 5 more minutes. I'll just watch one more YouTube video. It's fine. It's fine. I'll watch another episode of Colbert. It's okay. But I think that if given the opportunity, I would take it to go back to a recording studio. However, it does also limit the time that I have to just go at my own pace. Because you have the input of other people when you're in a larger group setting. And so there can be more distractions there. There can be tangents. There can also just be more discussion. And I don't have that when I'm here by myself. I'm just like, I make a choice and I go with it. So I think that there are pros and cons to both. I do think that I would enjoy a little bit more balance, but right now it's just here by myself every day.
So how did you find the right equipment to work from home? I imagine that was a little bit challenging.
It would have been if I did not have a crack engineer who does fantastic work, and he actually he helped me set up exactly what I needed. He helped me actually set up my studio, dial it in so that it sounded right. Because again, like, he knows what all of this equipment does. I pretty much, button monkey. I can just push one button and that starts it, and push another button and that stops it. And that's kind of where my know-how ends. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to have somebody help me figure out exactly what I needed. And he was great about talking through all of the, like, well, what are you looking for in the microphone, as far as, like, what do you want to be able to do with it? What do you want to be able to play the microphone more dynamically? Do you want it to just be sit in the middle and you don't move and it doesn't move and you're all fine? So he helped me figure a lot of that out, and so I was able to just buy exactly what he suggested and go from there. So
I imagine it's a pretty steep entry fee, though, to set up your own studio at home like that.
It can be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be if you're starting out. I mean, that's one of the things that, like, I get a lot of emails from people who say, "Hey, I love your work. I want to also be a narrator. What can you tell me?" And I love being able to try to help people to get into this, because I think that there are so many books being produced, and there aren't necessarily enough talented narrators. And so I'm always excited about helping other people get into this, because I love what I do, and I think other people would love it too. And so I try to encourage them to say that, like, get the setup that you can afford.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be the best of the best. If you can afford it, definitely go with better gear. That being said, there are certain things you can do to use middling equipment to get a great sound. You just have to get creative. And, there are ways that you can do that. And so it doesn't have to be incredibly cost prohibitive. Some of it is situational, where, like, if you live in the middle of downtown New York City and you live in a studio apartment and your neighbor upstairs plays the drums, like, you're probably not going to be able to record at home. Like, that's just the reality of it. I'm fortunate enough that my wife and 2 daughters and 2 dogs and a cat, they all are at home. I am actually in my mother and father-in-law's basement. They live about 20 minutes away from me, so I still drive to work every day. But their kids are all grown and out of the house, and it's just the 2 of them in the house, and they both work. So it's silent here. There's not all of that noise pollution. And so it was a very convenient setup for me. Whereas if I would have done this at home, I would have constantly had to say, wife, can you keep the girls quiet, please? Stop them from running around. Stop them from being children. Don't let them be children. And yeah, I didn't want to do that. So.
Well, that's nice that you have a place to go.
Yes. Again, I am incredibly blessed. I do not doubt that in the least.
Another place that is really helpful when you're starting out, in my opinion, is Ars Technica, or technical like blogs. They can list through some of the benefits and some of the defects of some of the equipment that you would buy if you're starting out. That's that's where I went to get all of my cheap equipment that does what I need it to do.
Nice. Absolutely. I mean, we're in the information age, and so this stuff is so readily available. This information is so readily available now. You just have to find it.
Mhm.
And the fact that you mentioned a site that is incredibly helpful. I mean, yeah, like having that information available is key. I know it existed 12 years ago when I started this. I just didn't know how to find it.
I would not have known how to find it either if like my boyfriend and all of his friends weren't computer science majors.
Nice.
Like even now I would be like, I have no idea what to do.
You know, that is one of the valuable things I learned though with this industry, and I mean just with life in general. It's not always what you know; it's who can help you find out. That's why like networking and connections are so important. If you want to advance and get ahead and, move forward at more than a snail's pace, like network, get to know people, ask questions, find out what they know so that, maybe they can help you learn something down the road that you might need. So, I mean, if I didn't know that casting director's son from high school, like she probably would have gotten my audition and just passed over it. But it's like there's those connections that really help you succeed.
I don't think that people understand that a lot of times those connections are organic too. You don't have to like go find people and hound them. It's
Hmm.
like, how do you know people who can help you that want to help you?
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
What are you working on right now? Can you talk about it?
I do believe I can. It is an independent project, so very few stipulations here. Right now, I am actually, as soon as I get off the line with you here, going to be finishing up CM Carney's um, Quintessence Crucible. It's the first in a series. Um, I think it's not classified as LitRPG. I think it is a progression novel.
Mm.
So very similar, kind of in the similar vein, but it's not a game world. So hence not the LitRPG. Um, but really enjoying it. I really like the story that he's come up with and the world that he's created. So
There seems to be a quick turnaround for you for getting the work done and then getting it published. It seems so quick.
fairly. You know, I think that if I were to be exclusively going through some of the bigger production companies, there tends to be a little bit more of a lag. But with the independent projects, there's a bit of variable to it with ACX on how quickly they will release a project that I've submitted to them. But again, I mean, because I'm contracting all of my proofing and mastering work, it's kind of up to me and these few individuals versus going with a publishing company that they've got a huge machine that they have to collaborate and fine tune. And so, I mean, sometimes things get sort of lost. But, they all end up getting out there. It's just a matter of how quickly. So, yeah, a lot of the stuff that I do independently ends up being a little bit of a quicker turnaround. That said, this year was crazy. So there've been a lot of, health delays and just life delays, and so things this year have not turned around quite as quickly as I would have hoped, but we
Okay.
do the best that we can, right?
I think you've done wonderful. You've entertained me this whole pandemic.
Good. And that's something that I'm incredibly thankful for, that so many people have reached out to me to say, like, thank you for providing distraction or sanity in these insane times. And I am so thankful that what I do gets to impact people in a positive way and will sometimes bring a little bit of brightness to an otherwise really dark time. And you know, I think it's great. I think that I'm so glad that this industry is as pervasive as it is in this time when we are all locked up and isolated, and we can, get away from the craziness that's life that shouldn't be like a horror movie or a fantasy or dark fantasy. But yeah, I'm so thankful that audiobooks is a good coping tool for a lot of people right now.
Well, thank you, Nick Podehl, for entertaining me this summer and for joining me today.
Absolutely. The pleasure was mine. Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. If you haven't heard Nick Podehl, I highly suggest any of the series that were listed in the podcast, a list of which will be in the description. Thank you and have a great day.